The arrow missed my head by less than a hand's width, and that was the moment I understood I was going to die on a planet nobody back home had ever heard of. My name is Ezra Voss, and 3 hours earlier I had been checking cargo manifests on a supply hauler crossing an empty stretch of space nobody bothered to chart. Then something tore through our hull like paper, alarms screamed, and the next thing I remember is waking up in wet jungle mud with smoke rising from a crash trench behind me. The impact had thrown me clear of the wreckage before it hit the ground, which was likely the only reason I survived at all. I remember the metal groaning as it plowed through the canopy, trees snapping like dry twigs, the whole hauler skidding to a stop against a ridge of exposed rock. I did not know what became of the rest of the crew. I did not have time to find out. The moment I pulled myself free of the mud, my ears still ringing, my ribs screaming with every breath, the jungle around me had already gone strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that meant every living thing nearby had gone still, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. I remember thinking, in that first confused minute, that I should stay near the wreckage. Rescue teams would look there first. That was the sensible plan, the plan any trained pilot would follow. I never got the chance to follow it. I did not know the name of the planet. I did not know the language spoken by the shapes moving through the trees. All I knew was pain in my ribs, a ringing in my ears, and the sound of running footsteps that were not my own. I pulled myself up against a fallen tree, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it. A small cry, not an animal, a child. I turned toward the sound and saw her for the first time, a small alien girl, thin, dressed in torn cloth, sprinting through the undergrowth with a kind of desperate speed that only fear can create. Behind her, spread out in a loose hunting line, came armed figures moving with cold, practiced discipline. They were not chasing an animal, they were chasing her. I did not think. I did not calculate risk, or wonder about first contact protocols, or ask myself what a stranded human pilot was supposed to do on a world he did not understand. I saw a child running from people who wanted to kill her, and my legs moved before my mind caught up. She stumbled near a cluster of broad-leafed plants only a few meters from where I stood, and that was when the first arrow whistled past her shoulder and buried itself in a tree trunk. Thick, dark liquid coated the tip. Poison. I did not need to speak their language to understand what that meant. I stepped out from the tree line, waving my arms, shouting something useless in a language none of them understood, hoping the sudden appearance of a strange new creature might buy her even a second. It worked, for a moment. The hunters hesitated, confused by the sight of me. Then one of them raised his bow again, aiming past me at the girl. I did not decide to move in front of her. My body simply did it. The arrow struck me high in the shoulder, and the pain that followed was unlike anything I had ever felt. A burning that spread outward from the wound, like fire crawling under my skin. I dropped to one knee, and the girl grabbed my arm, trying to pull me toward the undergrowth, her small hands shaking. Another arrow flew. I twisted my body, shielding her again, and this one grazed my side, tearing through my jacket. My vision blurred at the edges. The poison was already working its way through me, and I could feel my strength draining with every heartbeat. The hunters advanced slowly now, confident, as if they knew the poison would finish the job for them. I forced myself upright, placing my body fully between them and the child, my arms spread wide, even though I had no weapon, no plan, nothing but sheer refusal to move. The girl was crying behind me, whispering words I could not understand, tugging at my sleeve. I glanced back at her for half a second. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was something else in them too, something that looked almost like disbelief, as if she could not understand why a stranger would stand there and take an arrow meant for her. I did not have an answer for her, not one I could put into words even if she spoke my language. I only knew that I could not step aside and watch a child die in front of me. That was the whole of my reasoning. It was that simple, and it was that absolute. The lead hunter raised his bow one final time, aiming directly at my chest. I remember thinking, quite clearly, that this was likely the last thing I would ever see. green trees, gray sky, a frightened child clutching the back of my ruined jacket. Then the world exploded into motion. Shapes dropped from the trees above us, moving faster than I could track, weapons flashing in the dim light. Shouts filled the air, sharp and commanding, and within seconds, the hunters who had been chasing the girl were being driven back, some falling, others fleeing into the deeper jungle. New figures surrounded us now, dressed differently from the attackers, their faces marked with painted symbols I did not recognize. One of them, an older alien with silver markings across his face, knelt beside me and pressed something firm against the wound on my shoulder. He shouted orders to the others in a clipped, urgent tone. I could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. Move quickly. Time is short. The girl had not let go of my sleeve, even as the newcomers tried gently to pull her away. She kept looking at me, kept saying something over and over, the same short phrase, as if trying to make sure I heard it before the poison took my hearing along with everything else. My vision was narrowing now, the edges of the world folding into darkness. I felt myself being lifted, carried through the trees at a speed no human body could match. Branches blurred past overhead. The pain in my shoulder had become a distant thing, as if it belonged to someone else. The last clear thought I had, before the darkness finally closed over me, was not fear, it was something closer to relief. She was alive. Whatever happened to me next, she was alive, and that was enough. I do not remember the moment I stopped fighting to stay conscious. I only remember the feeling of falling, slow and endless, into a silence deeper than sleep, while somewhere above me, small hands kept gripping my sleeve, refusing to let go. When awareness returned, it did not come all at once. It came in fragments, scattered pieces of light and sound that took a long time to fit together into anything resembling sense. I remember warmth first, a kind of warmth that felt earned rather than accidental, as though someone had built a fire specifically to keep me from the cold. I remember voices, low and careful, speaking a language that still meant nothing to me, yet somehow carried a tone I understood perfectly. Concern, care, watchfulness. I opened my eyes to a low, woven ceiling, dim light filtering through gaps in the material above me. My shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the burning fire that had consumed me in the jungle was gone. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, my muscles protesting with a stiffness that told me I had been lying still for longer than a few hours. A face appeared above me, older, marked with the same silver patterns I remembered from the jungle. He said something quickly, then placed a firm hand on my chest, pressing me gently back down. I did not resist. I did not have the strength to, even if I wanted to. Over the following days, I began to understand my situation in pieces. I was in a hidden settlement, tucked deep within the forest canopy, built by people who clearly did not want to be found. The structures were simple, but sturdy, woven from branches and reinforced with some kind of resin that hardened like stone. Everyone here moved with quiet urgency, always listening, always watching the tree line, as if danger might arrive at any moment. There was a younger guardian, named Torin, quieter than the rest, who had apparently carried me through the trees after I collapsed from the poison. He did not speak to me much in those early days, but he checked on my wound often, adjusting the cloth wrapped around my shoulder, watching my breathing with a careful, professional eye. Sana told me later that Torin had lost his own brother to the same kind of poisoned arrow years earlier, and that watching a stranger survive the same toxin had shaken him in ways he did not know how to put into words. He would sit near the entrance of my sleeping quarters some evenings, saying nothing, simply keeping watch, as though guarding me the same way he guarded Elira. The girl visited me every day. I learned, through patient gestures and the slow exchange of simple words, that her name was Elira. She was young, younger than I had first guessed, though there was a seriousness in her eyes that seemed far older than her years. She would sit beside my bed for long stretches, saying very little, simply watching me, as if trying to memorize my face. One of the older women in the settlement, a healer named Sana, tended to my wounds with a mixture of practiced skill and careful curiosity. She would examine the arrow wound, then examine me, murmuring to herself in a tone that suggested confusion. It took me a while to understand why. The poison that should have killed me within hours had somehow been slowed, weakened, and eventually neutralized by something in my own body that none of them expected. My physiology, so different from theirs, had reacted to the toxin in ways their medicine had never encountered. I was, by every measure they understood, supposed to be dead. Instead, I was recovering. I learned other things slowly, through broken words and patient repetition. This settlement was not simply hiding from wild predators or rival tribes. They were hiding from something far more organized, far more dangerous. Alira was not just a lost child, she was the last surviving heir of a bloodline that had once ruled a much larger and more unified territory, before a violent uprising had torn that unity apart. Her family had been killed in that uprising. She had been smuggled away as an infant, passed from one loyal protector to another, always one step ahead of those who wanted to erase any trace of the old order. The hunters who had chased her through the jungle were not simple raiders. They were assassins, sent specifically to finish what the uprising had started years earlier. Alira had survived several such attempts already in her short life. The people around her, the quiet, watchful figures who tended to me and guarded the settlement, were the last remnants of her family's loyal guard, men and women who had given up everything to keep one small girl alive. I did not fully grasp the weight of what I had stumbled into, not at first. To me, in that jungle clearing, I had simply seen a frightened child running from people who meant her harm. I had not known about bloodlines, or uprisings, or ancient claims to power. I had only known that I could not stand by and do nothing. Alira, it seemed, understood this better than anyone. She would often sit beside me, tracing the outline of the scar forming on my shoulder with careful fingers, her expression unreadable. Once, through a mixture of words and gestures that took nearly an hour to piece together, she asked me why. Why had I stepped in front of the arrow? Why had I risked everything for someone I did not know, on a world that was not mine? I did not have a clever answer. I told her, as simply as I could, that some things did not require a reason beyond themselves. That when you see someone in danger, especially someone small and afraid, you do not stop to calculate the cost. You simply act, and you deal with whatever comes after. She listened to this with the kind of quiet intensity that made me feel, for a moment, as though she understood every word perfectly, despite the language barrier between us. Then she said something to Sana, who translated it back to me with visible hesitation, as though the words carried more weight than she was comfortable passing along. She said that among her people there existed an old custom, rarely invoked, called the vow of the first wound. When someone took harm meant for another, without demand for reward, a debt was created that could never truly be repaid, only honored. She told me, through Sana's careful translation, that she intended to honor it. Not as a child playing at grand words she did not understand, but as someone who had already lost everything once, and refused to lose the memory of the one person who had chosen to stand between her and death without knowing who she was. I did not take these words as seriously as I probably should have. I was a stranded pilot recovering from a poisoned wound, thousands of light years from anything resembling home, being cared for by strangers whose culture I barely understood. A child's solemn vow, however sincerely meant, felt like something I would remember fondly rather than something that would ever come to matter. Weeks passed before I was strong enough to travel. During that time, word reached the settlement that a human search vessel had detected wreckage consistent with our missing cargo hauler and was combing the system for survivors. The Guardians debated for days whether to make contact, weighing the risk of exposing their hidden settlement against the necessity of returning me to my own people. In the end, they chose to help me, guiding me through the jungle under cover of darkness to a location where the search vessel's scanners would be able to find me without ever detecting the settlement itself. The night before I left, Alira came to see me one final time. She did not cry, though I could tell she wanted to. Instead, she pressed something small into my hand, a carved token made from dark wood, marked with symbols I did not recognize. She spoke slowly, giving Sana time to translate each word with care. She told me that wherever I went, whatever became of my life afterward, the debt between us would remain. She said her people did not forget such things, even across years, even across distance. She said that one day, if fate allowed it, she would find a way to repay what could never truly be repaid. I thanked her as warmly as I could, told her to grow strong and safe, and promised, mostly to comfort her, that I would remember her too. I meant it in the moment, the way anyone means a promise, made to a frightened child they are unlikely to ever see again. I did not know, as I walked away from that hidden settlement and back toward the world I understood, that those words would echo across 30 years, waiting patiently for the day they would be called due. 30 years is a long time to carry a memory that nobody else believes. By the time I turned 50, I had stopped telling the story altogether, except on rare nights at the local tavern in the small farming town where I had settled, when someone new bought a round of drinks and asked about the scar on my shoulder. I would tell them about the crash, the jungle, the arrow, the child. Most people laughed politely and assumed I was exaggerating a hunting accident from my younger years. A few asked follow-up questions out of genuine curiosity, and I would answer as honestly as I could, though even I had begun to wonder, over the passing decades, whether my memory had softened the edges of what actually happened, the way memories often do. My life after returning from that lost world had been quiet, deliberately so. I left flying behind within a few years, unable to shake the strange restlessness that came from having survived something the medical scans back home could not explain. Instead, I settled into a simple life growing crops on a small plot of land near the edge of a farming community called Ridgewell, far from any major spaceport, far from anyone who might ask too many questions about a wound that healed strangely fast and left behind a scar unlike any other on record. I built a modest house. I planted rows of grain that swayed gently in the wind each autumn. I made friends with my neighbors, people like Callum, who ran the feed store in town, and Nadia, who taught the local school children and occasionally stopped by to trade fresh bread for vegetables. Life moved at a gentle, predictable pace, the kind of pace that suited a man who had already lived through more excitement than he ever wanted. Every so often, a doctor performing a routine physical would pause over the scar on my shoulder, frowning at readings that did not match anything in their records. I learned to give a short, simple answer. An old injury from my flying days, nothing worth dwelling on. It was easier than trying to explain a poison that should have killed me, absorbed by a body that refused to give up. Most people accepted the short answer and moved on, and I preferred it that way. There was a strange comfort in being ordinary, in letting the extraordinary parts of my life fade quietly into the background of daily chores and changing seasons. I never married, never had children of my own, though I never felt the absence as sharply as some might expect. In a way, I had already spent a piece of myself on a child who was not mine to protect, and something about that jungle clearing had settled a restlessness in me that I did not fully understand until years later. I found purpose instead in small things, in a good harvest, in teaching Nadia's students how seeds became grain, in the quiet satisfaction of a life lived without regret, even if it was a life far smaller than the one hinted at by the scar beneath my shirt. I did not follow galactic news closely. I had little reason to. The affairs of distant alien empires seemed as far removed from my quiet farm as the stars themselves. Occasionally, snippets would reach me through the market broadcasts, mentions of a distant world called Aetheris Prime undergoing what the newsreaders described as a long and complicated period of political reunification. I never connected those distant headlines to the frightened little girl I remembered, mostly because I never allowed myself to think about her too often. It was easier, in some ways, to let that chapter of my life remain a strange, half-faded dream rather than pick at it and risk losing the good parts of the memory along with the painful ones. Still, some nights, usually during storms, when the wind rattled against my windows the way it once rattled the leaves of that alien jungle, I would take out the small carved token a Lyra had given me all those years ago. I kept it in a drawer beside my bed, wrapped in a strip of old cloth. I would turn it over in my hands, tracing the symbols I never learned to read, and wonder, quietly, whether she had survived, whether she had grown up safe, whether the vow she made as a frightened child had meant anything more than the desperate promise of someone too young to understand what promises truly cost. I never expected an answer to that wondering, certainly not one that would arrive at my front door. It began, as these things often do, with small signs I did not think much of at the time. A neighboring farmer mentioned that unfamiliar travelers had been asking around town, inquiring about old crash records from decades earlier, specifically records involving a cargo hauler that had gone missing near an uncharted system many years ago. I assumed it was some kind of insurance matter, or perhaps historians compiling records of early frontier expansion. I did not think it concerned me directly, even though the timeline matched almost exactly with my own disappearance and eventual return all those years ago. Then Nadia mentioned, almost in passing during one of her visits, that a strange ship had been spotted entering orbit above our system, sleek and unlike anything manufactured by any of the local shipping companies. Local authorities had been notified, she said, though nobody seemed alarmed, since the ship had made no aggressive moves and had simply requested standard docking clearance at the regional spaceport nearly 200 kilometers from Ridgewell. I remember feeling an odd unease settle over me that evening, a feeling I could not quite explain. It was not fear exactly, it was closer to recognition, the way a familiar smell can trigger a memory long before your conscious mind catches up to why. 3 days later, a formal notice arrived at my farm, delivered not through the usual postal drone, but by a young regional official who seemed nervous and slightly out of his depth. He explained that a diplomatic delegation representing an alien government had formally requested a private meeting with me, citing matters of historical significance related to first contact records. He handed me a data slate containing basic information about the delegation, though much of it remained vague, citing diplomatic discretion. I sat with that slate for a long while after the official left, staring at the unfamiliar emblem displayed on its screen. It was a stylized emblem, elegant and layered, depicting overlapping wings around a central point of light. Something about it stirred a memory just out of reach, though I could not place exactly why. The following week, the delegation arrived at my farm directly, 3 figures stepping down from a modest shuttle that had landed carefully in my back field, avoiding the crop rows with a precision that suggested deliberate respect rather than mere convenience. I stood on my porch, wiping dirt from my hands, feeling suddenly very aware of how ordinary I must have looked to whoever these visitors were. The lead figure was an alien woman, tall and composed, her skin marked with faint silver patterns that immediately sent a jolt of recognition through me, though 30 years had dulled the specifics of that memory considerably. She introduced herself in careful, accented words as an envoy of the Aetheran imperial court, representing what she called the restored throne of Aetheris Prime. I invited them inside, mostly out of habit and manners rather than any clear understanding of what was happening. We sat around my kitchen table, an odd tableau of an alien diplomatic party perched carefully on old wooden chairs while I brewed tea out of pure nervous instinct, unsure what else to do with my hands. The envoy, who introduced herself as Mira, began speaking slowly, choosing her words with obvious care. She explained that Aetheris Prime had, over the past 3 decades, undergone a long and difficult process of reunification following a period of civil conflict that had fractured the old empire into competing factions. She explained that the current sovereign of that reunified empire had, for many years, quietly directed efforts toward locating a specific individual connected to events that took place during the darkest years of that conflict. I felt my pulse quicken, though I told myself it was likely coincidence, a case of mistaken identity, some historical mix-up that would resolve itself once they realized I was simply a retired farmer with no relevant connection to their affairs. Mira reached into a satchel and withdrew a small, carefully preserved case. Inside, resting on a bed of dark fabric, was an arrowhead, aged and worn, its tip still faintly discolored with the remnants of some old substance. She explained that this arrowhead had been recovered decades earlier from the site of an assassination attempt against a child who would later become the ruling sovereign of the restored empire. She explained that the arrowhead had been kept ever since as a sacred relic, a physical reminder of a debt that the sovereign considered still unpaid. My hands had gone still around my teacup. I did not need her to explain further. I already knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in my chest, exactly which arrowhead this was, and exactly which wound it had once been meant to deliver. I asked her, my voice quieter than I intended, whether the child from that story had survived. Mira looked at me for a long moment before answering, and something in her expression softened, as though she understood the weight the question carried for me personally. She told me that the child had not only survived, but had gone on to reunite a fractured empire, ending decades of conflict and bringing lasting stability to billions of her people. She told me this sovereign now bore the title of Empress, ruling not through inherited fear, but through a reputation for fairness and resolve that had earned genuine loyalty across every faction that had once opposed her family's claim to the throne. She told me the Empress had never forgotten the stranger who stood between her and an assassin's arrow, asking for nothing in return. She told me the Empress had spent years quietly searching, through careful and respectful channels, for any record of what had become of that stranger after he was recovered by a passing human vessel. She told me, finally, that the Empress now formally requested my presence at the imperial court on Aetheris Prime, not as a summons demanding obedience, but as an invitation extended with the deepest respect her position allowed, so that a debt 30 years old might finally be acknowledged properly, in the manner her people believed it deserved. I sat in silence for a long moment after she finished speaking, the weight of 30 quiet years settling strangely against the sudden reality unfolding at my kitchen table. Somewhere out there, across an unimaginable distance, the frightened child who once gripped my sleeve in a jungle clearing had grown into a ruler powerful enough to send diplomatic envoys across the stars simply to find me. I looked down at my hands, rough from decades of farm work, and thought about the small carved token still wrapped carefully in my bedside drawer. I thought about a promise made to comfort a frightened child, a promise I never truly expected to matter beyond that single night in a hidden jungle settlement. Mira waited patiently for my answer, her expression calm but clearly attentive to whatever I might say next. I realized, sitting there in my own familiar kitchen, surrounded by alien visitors and an impossible piece of my own forgotten history, that there was really only one answer I could give. I told Mira that I would go, though I asked for a few days to arrange matters on the farm before departing. She agreed without hesitation, explaining that the journey itself would take some time regardless, given the distance between my quiet corner of human space and the restored territories of Aetheris Prime. Word spread quickly through Ridgewell once the alien shuttle lifted off from my back field. Callum stopped by that same evening, eyes wide with disbelief, asking if the stories about my scar had somehow turned out to be true after all these years. Nadia brought a few of her curious students by the following afternoon, though I kept the details vague, unwilling to explain something I barely understood myself. I found myself, for the first time in decades, genuinely uncertain how to answer simple questions about my own life. Callum sat with me on my porch the night before I left, passing a jug of cider back and forth between us, the way we had done at the end of countless harvests. He asked me, quietly, if I was afraid. I told him honestly that I did not know what to feel, that fear seemed like the wrong word for something that felt more like standing at the edge of a memory I had never expected to revisit. He clapped me on the good shoulder, the one without the old scar, and told me that whatever happened out there among the stars, Ridgewell would still be here when I got back, fields and all. It was a small thing to say, but it steadied me more than he probably realized. The days leading up to my departure passed in a strange blur of practical arrangements and quiet disbelief. I asked Callum to look after my fields while I was away, promising an explanation once I returned, though I privately wondered if I would have the words to explain any of this properly even then. I packed lightly, uncertain what a farmer was supposed to bring to an alien imperial court, eventually settling on simple, practical clothing, and, almost as an afterthought, the small carved token from my bedside drawer, wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked into my jacket pocket. The delegation returned exactly when promised, and I boarded their shuttle with a strange mixture of anxiety and something close to excitement, an emotion I had not felt in longer than I cared to admit. The interior of the shuttle was elegant, but understated, its design reflecting a culture that valued function alongside beauty rather than excess for its own sake. Mira remained with me throughout much of the journey, patiently answering questions as they occurred to me, her manner shifting gradually from formal diplomatic distance to something closer to genuine warmth as the days passed. She explained more about the history of Atheris Prime, filling in details that helped me understand the scale of what had happened since I last set foot on that world. The uprising that had killed Alira's parents, she explained, had fractured the old unified empire into several competing factions, each claiming legitimacy through various justifications, none willing to yield to the others. For years, the planet had suffered under fragmented rule, marked by periodic conflicts between rival territories, each faction attempting to consolidate power while systematically hunting down any remaining trace of the old royal bloodline that might one day challenge their claims. Alira, protected throughout her childhood and early adulthood by a shrinking circle of loyal guardians, had spent years moving quietly between hidden settlements, narrowly avoiding capture on more than one occasion. Mira explained that the guardians who protected her had slowly built a network of quiet support among common people disillusioned by the endless conflict between the ruling factions. Ordinary citizens who remembered the relative peace of the old unified empire and grew weary of decades spent under fractured, competing rule. By the time Alira reached adulthood, that quiet network had grown substantial enough to support a genuine claim to reunification. Mira described, with obvious pride, the careful years Alira spent building alliances between rival factions, convincing exhausted leaders that continued fragmentation served no one, offering fair terms rather than demanding submission, earning loyalty through demonstrated wisdom rather than inherited authority alone. The final unification, Mira explained, had come not through overwhelming conquest, but through a series of negotiated agreements that even former rivals eventually recognized as more beneficial than continued conflict. Alira had been formally recognized as Empress a little over a decade earlier, and in the years since had focused primarily on rebuilding infrastructure damaged by decades of fighting, establishing fair trade agreements between former rival territories, and cautiously opening diplomatic channels with neighboring civilizations, including, more recently, humanity itself. I listened to all of this with a growing sense of quiet astonishment, struggling to reconcile the frightened child I remembered gripping my sleeve in a jungle clearing with the composed, capable ruler Mira described. It felt, in some ways, like hearing the plot of an elaborate story rather than the actual history of someone I had personally known, however briefly, decades earlier. As our journey continued, Mira eventually asked me a question of her own, one that seemed to have been waiting patiently beneath her careful diplomatic manner. She asked why, all those years ago, I had chosen to step between a stranger's child and a volley of poisoned arrows, risking my own life for someone whose language I did not even speak. I considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. I told her that I had not really chosen anything in the deliberate sense she seemed to be asking about. I told her that some decisions do not feel like decisions at all in the moment they happen. You simply see someone in danger, and your body moves before your mind finishes weighing the consequences. I told her that I had spent little time since then congratulating myself for what I did, mostly because it never felt like something worth congratulating. It felt, simply, like the only thing a decent person could have done in that situation. Mira seemed to consider my answer carefully, and something in her expression suggested that this simple explanation meant more to her, and perhaps to the culture she represented, than any grander justification might have. As we approached the outer boundaries of the Etherean system, I found myself pressed against the viewport, watching the planet grow larger ahead of us. Aetheris Prime looked different from my memory, though I supposed my memory of it was limited entirely to a single stretch of dense jungle canopy I had experienced while gravely wounded decades earlier. From orbit, the planet displayed vast interconnected cities, their architecture blending organic curves reminiscent of the old tribal settlements with newer, more structured designs that spoke of deliberate, unified planning. Mira pointed out the capital region as we descended, a sprawling city built around what she described as the restored imperial court, a structure combining ancient ceremonial design with modern function, deliberately built to honor both the old traditions and the new unity Elira had worked so hard to establish. The shuttle descended smoothly through the atmosphere, eventually settling onto a landing platform surrounded by tall, elegant spires. I stepped out onto the platform, my legs slightly unsteady, whether from the journey or simple nervous anticipation, I could not entirely say. The air here felt familiar in ways I had not expected, carrying faint traces of the same dense, earthy scent I remembered from that jungle so many years earlier, though softened now by the presence of careful cultivation rather than untamed wilderness. A formal escort awaited us at the platform, dressed in ceremonial attire that combined practical armor with elegant decorative elements. They greeted Mira with clear respect, then turned their attention to me, and I felt distinctly out of place standing among such formal ceremony in my simple traveling clothes. Mira noticed my discomfort and offered a reassuring smile. She explained that the Empress had specifically requested that I not be asked to alter my appearance or manner for the occasion, insisting that I be received exactly as I was, without unnecessary formality imposed upon someone she considered, in her own words, an honored equal rather than a subject to be dressed for spectacle. That small detail settled something anxious in my chest, a reminder that whatever grand political weight this meeting carried for the Empire, it remained, at its core, a reunion between two people connected by a single desperate moment decades earlier. The escort led us through wide, elegant corridors toward the heart of the imperial court, and I found myself increasingly aware of quiet onlookers gathering along our path, watching with a mixture of curiosity and something closer to reverence, as though word of my arrival had already spread throughout the court itself. I did not fully understand, in that moment, the significance my presence apparently held for so many people I had never met, though I would come to understand it fully soon enough. As we approached a set of tall, ornate doors marking the entrance to the main audience chamber, Mira paused beside me, placing a steadying hand briefly on my arm. She told me, quietly, that whatever happened beyond those doors, I should trust that it came from genuine feeling rather than mere political ceremony. She told me the Empress had waited 30 years for this moment and had insisted on handling every detail personally rather than delegating it to advisors as tradition might normally dictate. I nodded, though I still did not fully understand what she meant. The doors began to open slowly before us, revealing a vast chamber filled with gathered nobility, advisors, and dignitaries, all turning their attention toward the entrance as the doors parted fully. At the far end of that chamber, seated upon an elegant throne that somehow managed to look both powerful and unpretentious, sat a woman I did not immediately recognize, though something deep and instinctive within me stirred the moment our eyes met across the vast distance of that chamber. 30 years had transformed the frightened child I remembered into a composed, formidable ruler, marked by an unmistakable strength that radiated even from a distance. Yet as our gazes locked across that grand hall, I saw something flicker briefly across her expression, something raw and unguarded beneath the practiced composure of imperial authority, something that told me, without any need for words, that she remembered me exactly as clearly as I remembered her. The chamber fell silent as I walked forward, escorted by Mira, my footsteps echoing against polished stone that had witnessed, I imagined, countless formal ceremonies over the decades since this empire had been restored. Yet nothing about the atmosphere in that room felt routine. Every gathered noble and advisor watched with an intensity that suggested they understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be remembered and retold for generations. I stopped at a respectful distance from the throne, uncertain of proper protocol, though nobody had explained specific formalities to me beforehand. I simply stood, looking up at the woman who had once been a frightened child, clutching my sleeve in a jungle clearing, now transformed into the composed ruler of a reunified empire spanning countless worlds. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with 30 years of unspoken history, until the Empress rose slowly from her throne, her movements deliberate and measured, drawing a soft murmur of surprise from the gathered court. She descended the few steps from her raised platform, closing the distance between us with slow, purposeful steps, until she stood directly before me, close enough now that I could see the faint, familiar traces of the child I remembered still present beneath the composed features of the woman she had become. She spoke first, her voice steady despite the obvious emotion beneath it, addressing me not in the formal, translated speech Mira had used throughout our journey, but in careful, deliberately practiced words of my own language, clearly rehearsed for this exact moment. She said my name, quietly, the syllables slightly awkward on her tongue, but unmistakable nonetheless. She said that she had waited 30 years to speak this name aloud to the man who owned it, and that no words she had practiced beforehand felt adequate enough to properly convey what this moment meant to her personally, separate entirely from any political weight the gathered court might place upon it. I felt an unexpected tightness in my throat and found myself momentarily unable to respond, simply looking at her, searching for traces of the frightened child I remembered within the composed strength standing before me now. Then, without further warning, without any signal to the gathered nobles around us, the Empress of a reunified galactic power lowered herself slowly to one knee before me. The chamber erupted into startled murmurs, quickly silenced by a firm gesture from one of her advisors, though the shock rippling through the gathered court remained clearly visible on every face. I understood immediately, even without full knowledge of their customs, that this was an act without precedent, a ruler kneeling not before a fellow sovereign or a religious figure, but before a single ordinary individual with no political standing whatsoever. She remained kneeling, looking up at me with an expression that held none of the practiced composure she likely displayed during formal court proceedings. In that moment, she looked simply like the frightened child I remembered, finally given the chance to properly express gratitude that had waited 3 long decades to be spoken. She told me, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, that 30 years earlier, a stranger from a world she did not know had stepped between her and certain death, asking for nothing in return, expecting no reward, motivated by nothing more than simple decency toward a frightened child. She told me that single act, small as it may have seemed to me at the time, had rippled outward across 3 decades, giving her the chance to grow, to fight, to eventually reunite an empire fractured by decades of needless conflict. She told the gathered court, though her eyes remained fixed on mine throughout, that every peace treaty she had negotiated, every rebuilt city, every life saved through the ending of decades of pointless fighting, existed only because a stranger once chose kindness over self-preservation in a jungle clearing on a forgotten corner of her homeworld. She said that her people held an old custom regarding debts created through such selfless sacrifice, a custom that considered such debts impossible to fully repay, only properly honored. She said that today, in front of her entire court, she wished to formally honor that debt, not as a closed transaction to be settled and forgotten, but as a permanent, living acknowledgement of what one act of genuine kindness could achieve across time and distance. She rose slowly from her kneeling position, though she continued holding my gaze with an intensity that left no doubt about the sincerity behind her formal words. She announced, her voice carrying clear authority now, that from this day forward I would be recognized throughout her empire as a permanent honored guest, granted free passage and welcome across every world under her rule, a living symbol of the debt her people owed to selfless kindness shown without expectation of reward. She announced further that she wished to establish, in commemoration of this moment, a new formal alliance between her empire and humanity, built specifically upon the principles that had brought us together in that jungle clearing decades earlier: mutual respect, selfless cooperation, and the recognition that true strength came not from conquest, but from the willingness to protect those who could not protect themselves. The gathered court erupted into applause following her announcement, though I remained fixed in place, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what a single instinctive decision, made decades earlier without any thought of consequence, had ultimately produced. After the formal proceedings concluded, Alira invited me to a private chamber away from the crowded formality of her court, where we could speak plainly, without the weight of ceremony pressing upon every word. There, seated across from each other at a simple table, she finally allowed herself to relax into something closer to genuine warmth, asking me questions about the life I had lived over the past 30 years with obvious sincere curiosity rather than diplomatic obligation. I told her about my quiet farm, about Callum and Nadia, and the simple rhythms of life in Ridgewell. She listened with evident delight, remarking that she often wondered, during difficult years of conflict and negotiation, what kind of life the stranger who saved her might have chosen afterward, hoping quietly that it had been a peaceful one. I asked her, in turn, about the years between that jungle clearing and this grand chamber, and she spoke honestly about the difficulties, the losses, the moments of doubt that had nearly convinced her the fractured empire could never truly be reunited. She spoke of guardians who had given their lives protecting her over the years, of narrow escapes from assassination attempts that echoed uncomfortably close to the one I had witnessed personally, of long nights spent wondering whether the vision of unity she carried was worth the sacrifices it demanded from those loyal to her cause. Through all of it, she told me, the memory of a stranger who asked for nothing while giving everything had remained a quiet source of strength, proof that selfless kindness existed even among strangers from entirely different worlds, proof worth fighting to protect and eventually replicate across her own fractured empire. Before I departed to return home, Alira presented me with a small token of her own, mirroring the gift she had given me as a frightened child decades earlier. This one, carved from similarly dark wood, but far more elaborate, depicted two figures standing together, one small and one larger, shielding each other against an unseen threat. She told me it represented not a debt now settled, but a bond now permanently woven into the history of her people, a reminder that kindness, however small it might seem in the moment, could shape the fate of entire worlds. As I boarded the shuttle that would carry me back toward my quiet farm in Ridgewell, I found myself reflecting on the strange, improbable journey that single instinctive decision had set into motion. I had not stepped into that jungle clearing 30 years earlier hoping for gratitude, recognition, or reward. I had simply seen a frightened child in danger and refused to stand aside. Yet that simple refusal, born from nothing more complicated than basic human decency, had ultimately reshaped the fate of an entire empire, ended decades of needless conflict, and forged a lasting bond between two civilizations that might never have found common ground otherwise. I returned to my farm, not as a hero seeking recognition, but simply as the same man I had always been, now carrying with me the quiet knowledge that even the smallest acts of kindness, offered without hesitation and without expectation of reward, could ripple outward across time and distance in ways no one could ever fully predict. And somewhere among the stars, an empire remembered, and an empress who once was a frightened child now ruled with the same simple lesson at the heart of everything she built, that true strength lies not in conquest or fear, but in the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves, expecting nothing in return.